Good evening, and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Josie from Greenlight, and we are thrilled to host tonight's event with Andre Henry presenting his new book, All the White Friends I Couldn't Keep, Hope and Hard Pills to Swallow, about fighting for Black lives. They'll be talking with Linda Sarsour, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Andre, Linda, and the team at Convergent Books for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up tonight. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. Now, just a few housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. They can see that you're here, though, and there are a couple different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. That's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and interact with fellow attendees. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program. And importantly, tonight's featured book, All the White Friends I Couldn't Keep, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person from 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. at both of our locations, where you can purchase Andre's book and many others. You can also order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or shipping anywhere in the US. I'll drop the buy link in the chat. As a thank you for attending tonight's virtual event, we're also offering 10% off the featured book. Enter coupon code GreenlightEvents10 into the coupon discount section at checkout online for 10% off. Now on to the good stuff. Our interviewer tonight is Linda Sarsour. Linda is an author, award-winning racial justice and civil rights activist, seasoned community organizer, and mother of three. Recognized for her award-winning intersectional work, she served as national co-chair of the Women's March, helping to organize the largest single-day protest in U.S. history. She is the former executive director of the Arab American Association of New York and co-founder of the first Muslim online organizing platform, Empower Change, as well as Until Freedom, a national racial justice organization working with Black and Brown communities across the country. She'll be speaking with our featured author tonight, Andre Henry. Andre is an award-winning musician, writer, and activist. He is a columnist for Religion News Service and the author of the newsletter Hope and Hard Pills. He is a student of nonviolent struggle, having organized protests in Los Angeles, where he lives, and studied under international movement leaders through the Harvard Kennedy School. His work in pursuit of racial justice has been featured in the New Yorker and The Nation and on Liturgist podcast. In his personal and thought-provoking new book, Henry shares stories from his own path to activism and explores how the historical divides between Black people and non-Black people are expressed through our most mundane interactions, and why the struggle won't be resolved through civil discourse, diversity hires, interracial relationships, or education. What we need is a revolution, Henry argues, one that moves beyond symbolic progress to disrupt systems of racial violence and inequality in tangible, creative ways. So Andre is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then he'll be talking with Linda and all of you. Please take it away, Andre.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I can't see you or see your comments, and it's weird because you're there. So let's go to chapter 2. But I felt like it would be rude if I didn't say hello first. Hi. The whole world is Stone Mountain. I was raised in the shadow of Confederate Mount Rushmore, in a small Georgia town called Stone Mountain. The place gets its name from a giant piece of quartz that stands about a mile high at the edge of town. The mountain's north face hosts the largest bas-relief carving in the world, a giant depiction of Confederate generals Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson and Confederate President Jefferson Davis on horseback. It was commissioned by Klan sympathizers who'd initially hoped to include a parade of Klansmen in the carving. At 190 feet across and 90 feet tall, it's the largest Confederate monument in the country. The modern Ku Klux Klan first set fire to a cross on that very rock. One 4th of July, my sweet mother, a hard-working immigrant, took my siblings and me to picnic at Stone Mountain Park. As night fell, she spread a blanket on the damp grass at the mountain's base and passed around half-frozen Capri Suns as we prepared to watch the famous laser show spectacular, where the generals go dark and fast-paced cartoons are projected against the mountainside to popular music. As the show began, Mom, Mackie we called her, couldn't stop grinning. She leaned in close with a smile and said, "There's a part where they make the soldiers move." She seemed as excited about the imminent resurrection of General Lee as most Americans are about the fireworks grand finale. I was excited too, imagining a kind of night at the museum situation where those stone sentinels would peel themselves away from the rock and dance to the crisscross song Jump. After a few cartoons set to country songs I was too young and black to recognize, the show paused. The lights dimmed. The sound of a rolling snare drum came dragging its feet through the speakers. It was followed by the voice of Elvis Presley singing, "I wish I was in the land of cotton. Old times there are not forgotten. Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland." As the music crescendoed, a laser began to slowly trace the carved figures until they were all standing in multicolored stenciled glory. Then the flickering silhouette of General Lee, I kid you not, turned his gaze on us mortals below, put on his hat, kicked his horse, and began to ride. Jackson and Davis followed as Elvis changed choruses. Glory, glory, hallelujah, his truth is marching on. At first, the three men's steeds took a dignified pace. Then General Lee spurred his horse into a gallop, and the Confederates followed suit. Lee drew his sword and held it high above his head as the three rebels turned toward us in full-on charge. The sound of hundreds of people hooting and clapping and cheering filled the air. In hindsight, it seems odd that people would commemorate America's birthday by applauding three men who once declared war on the country. Even odder is the memory of my black mother wiggling her hips at the thought of a family picnic on the ground where the KKK was resurrected, all while I wish I Was in Dixie played in the background. If Mackie had recognized the laser show for what I do now, white supremacist pageantry, she might have marched our family right out of that neo-Confederate theme park and across the Caribbean Sea in a fury to raise us in her home country. But none of us were furious, because we didn't really know the history. There was no mention of the ties between Stone Mountain and the Klan in Stone Mountain Park. They covered it up. In Stone Mountain, the racist content of mundane American life was obscured by a big lie told throughout the white world. The lie the white world tells is racism is not a problem here, no matter where here may be. White people from the southern U.S. claim they're not racist because they're not members of the Proud Boys. Northern whites claim they aren't racist because they aren't Southerners. European whites claim they're not racist because they're not Americans. Latino whites claim they're not racist because they're not Europeans or Americans. Nevertheless, the white world stands guilty of a crime of unfathomable scope. Some call it the Ma'afa, a Swahili word meaning something like great disaster, referring to the 15 million indigenous Africans violently abducted from their homelands to be sold as beasts of burden in the so-called New World. They were held as captives in work camps, tortured and terrorized for generations. Their descendants have continued to suffer through endless innovations of racial violence throughout history, including apartheids and poverty, police brutality and surveillance, imperialist wars, and outright terrorism. The Ma'afa's body count is innumerable. That's why some black scholars call it the Black Holocaust. Contrary to what people love to say about racial violence, that it springs from ignorance or blind hatred, the Ma'afa wasn't and isn't senseless. The crime was undertaken for a reason: profit. Over and over again in their writings about the slave trade, white men spoke of how they must use the sweat and suffering of enslaved Africans to build their banks and textile industries, their ships and plantation homes, and to produce whatever else they needed to buy or sell. Their coffee, tea, sugar, rum, cotton, indigo. It was just business. Much of the world is implicated in the crime and the cover-up. Britain couldn't have become great without their work camps in Jamaica, but British schools don't spend much time teaching about the violence the British Empire wrought in its colonies. In 2005, the French government tried to pass legislation that urged schools to emphasize the positive role of colonialism, while schools glossed over the Black Rebellion that ended French enslavement in Haiti. Brazil sweeps its history of anti-Black ethnic cleansing under the rug of racial democracy, suggesting that the same country that once ran the largest slave market now has little to no racism. In 2018, the Southern Poverty Law Center surveyed students from 1,000 high schools in the U.S. and found that fewer than half of them had ever heard of the Middle Passage. My point is that this atrocity, that complicity in this atrocity is as widespread as the denial. The many nations who've benefited so much from the Ma'afa lack the moral courage to confess that the breaking of black bodies is a central part of their stories.
Thank you, Andre. That was so beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I hope for folks who haven't yet gotten Andre's book, just as you can see here, I'm a big fan. I have many of Andre's books, and I'm still contemplating who I'm going to give those books to. So I'm from Brooklyn, so I'm not like Andre. He's so beautiful and so soft spoken, and I'm just like my voice is very loud. So just to put that out there. And I'm just honored to be here, Andre. And I was telling you earlier, for folks that haven't gotten this book, for many of us in the movement, many of us who come from marginalized communities and are kind of leading in different areas, this book really spoke to me. It made me feel like I wasn't, you know, being irrational. Like I wasn't like, am I crazy? Like, is this really happening? I'm like, why are these people asking me these questions? Why is it just us? Do we actually, are we the only people that are seeing what's happening around us? Like, is it just us? And so this book is not only is it important for obviously for white folks to read. I think the title is provocative in of itself, that I think some white people that don't even like us are going to be like, let me see what these people got to say about it. Let me see what this man, Mr. Henry, got to say. And I think that is really important. But I also think it's an ode to Black and brown people to say, you know what, your experience is my experience, and we're all in this together. So I appreciate you for writing this book. And that's really my first question, Andre. When I read this book, like, why this book? Why all the white friends I couldn't keep? What was like, the thing that was like, this is where I'm going with my writing. You could have wrote about a lot of things, your music, I mean, even letters in the book, but so many other things. But why this?
Yeah, well, first I want to say, Linda, it's so great to have you here as my conversation partner, and I'm so honored to have you here, and also to hear like how it resonated with you personally, because as I was writing it, I was having the same questions, like maybe I'm crazy, maybe the whole world is about to find out how crazy I am, and the book really came out of an open letter that I wrote to all the white friends I couldn't keep in 2019, because the folks that I talk about in this book, some of them had been online saying things like Andre's a racist, he hates white people, all that stuff. And I just felt like you can't say things like that without a receipt. Like, show me the text message or the blog post or the tweet or whatever where I said that. And so I decided that I would write an open letter to them as a receipt of my love to them, and make my case about why our relationships fell apart, which was not about hatred, but about the fact that as I was waking up as I was going through my own political awakening and coming to understand American history more and systemic racism more and the power of nonviolent struggle, and calling people to join me in the movement to expand like this anti-racist movement, they became my biggest opposers. People that I love, that I call family, that they were doing exactly what they were doing right then, calling me a racist and saying I'm being hateful. And so a literary agent reached out, and I don't know how long Steve had been following me, but my agent, Steve Ross, now he reached out and he said he felt like that blog post could be a book. And I was like, I never thought of that. I didn't see that. But, he works with authors professionally. So I felt like if he saw the potential for it to become a book, then, with some coaching, then I could do it. And so that was what we agreed to. And by the time I finished the proposal, I realized, like you said, I didn't want to expand the book into a longer letter to the people that I already knew weren't listening. I wanted to write the book that I needed 8 years ago, you know? So, and to say to someone in our position, hey, you know what? There is hope for change. There's a movement to build. And in order for you to join it, you might have to let some people go.
Mm-mm. I mean, when I think about, when I even first saw the title before I kind of gotten into what it's actually about, it really, I sat with the title because as a organizer of the Women's March, and as a woman of color organizing with two other women of color who were like in the leadership and the kind of visibility of the Women's March. One was, as you know, a Mexican Chicana woman named Carmen Perez, and the other woman was Tamika D. Mallory, who's obviously Black from New York, actually from Harlem.
Yeah.
And organizing the Women's March, it was this moment of like, yes, women came together, and we actually thought we had like cracked the code. We were like, wait a minute, maybe this feminism thing works, and maybe the white ladies and all of us could get together, we could actually do some transformative things. And
Yeah.
what we had realized was, as we continued the work of the Women's March, really trying to bring in issues of racial justice, criminal justice, immigration and immigrant rights, and really trying to bring those at the center of the conversation we wanted to have about the power women can have when we organize together, but without ignoring that even within the women group
Mm-hmm.
or people who identify as women, we ourselves had so much work to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so that unfortunately also made our relationships tense. White women, not all white women, but many white women with us at the Women's March, must have never had deep relationships with Black and brown people, because there were things about where we came from that it was hard for them to understand. For me, for example, I'm Palestinian. Many white women who came out of some Christian communities and understood
Yes.
the relationship between Christianity and Israel from their perspectives as evangelicals or whatever kind of,
Yeah.
or even Christian Zionists, we're like, what is this lady talking about? Like, absolutely
Right.
not. We don't agree, but we agree here. And then, of course, as you know, with Tamika and a lot of her gun violence work and some of the groups and Black-led groups that she organized with, that white women were really uncomfortable with, and there was no context. And so I wanted to, kind of bring that to the forefront, Andre, to talk a little bit about, if you want to share even more themes about what were some of the things that your white friends were like, not chill, like I'm not down with what you're saying. Like, what were some of the themes and specific
Yeah.
like you and them kind of drifted at some point?
Yeah, when you talk about that, your experience, kind of this missing intersectionality piece, it makes me think of a couple of chapters in the book. One is the chapter that is titled "We Can All Be White," right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
one of the mistakes that I made early in my own journey was I just assumed that people, Latinx people, Asian American people. I just assumed that we would all be natural allies, right? When we talk about white supremacy, because ultimately it's colonization, right? It's trying to get all these subjugated people to assimilate to the dominant culture. And what I found was that anti-blackness was like this through line through everything. So you just couldn't assume that anyone was like on your side, because the colonial common sense, the colonial regime wants us all to aspire to assimilate into whiteness, right? And that was a huge lesson, and it brought up all kinds of questions about solidarity, right? Like, what does it mean to really have solidarity among people who are struggling against the same thing as you? Like, what I hear in your case is like, women could be this huge, broad-based coalition against, patriarchy and gender violence and all that kind of stuff. But there are these other lines within that large category that unity has to be built around, and it makes the work of solidarity a bit more nuanced and complex, because it can't just be like, let's all just get along, let's all just quote unquote forget our differences and hug it out, which is what a lot of white people were telling me to do as a black man. Like, like, oh, you're bitter, you just need to forgive, that's what they say about us. And then I even got some of that from non-black people of color who would come in and they were defending white people so strongly during that time. And it also makes me think about the chapter "White Men Explain Things to Me," because I found after I got into the movement, that there were a lot of white men in particular who just entered the movement and automatically assumed that they were mentors of everybody else, right? And like, we're here now, we're gonna set your house in order and all that kind of thing, which is historic, right? This is something that civil rights activists were complaining about in the 60s. So yeah, I mean, those are things that it brings up for me about how solidarity can be complex, and that's also a thing that I kind of am a little bit not, I don't want to say fearful, but that's the best word that I have right now about the book, because it says white on the cover, and that can be distracting for some people, you know, but it's a really more complex argument than that.
And I think I asked you that knowing that you would go to that place because it's important for us to understand whiteness, not just as white people. And I think
Yes.
a lot of the divisions online that we have about talking about white or whiteness, the reason why people take it personal is because they think it's like we're talking about like individual white people, but it's actually
Yes.
we're talking about something much greater than white people. And
Mm.
as you can tell from as a fair-skinned Arab American, Palestinian American, your point about anti-black racism being a thread amongst communities, I will say that about my own.
Yeah.
It's one of the, as they say, I also have the responsibility of getting my cousins, as we say sometimes to our white
Yeah.
friends, go get your cousins.
Yeah.
The Arabs got to go get their cousins, the Asians got to go get their cousins, like
Yeah.
everybody got to go get their cousins. And I think that this country has unfortunately set a precedent for immigrant communities to want to be as close to whiteness as possible.
Yes.
And that is definitely the case for a lot of Arab Americans from the Levant area, like the Syrian, Lebanese, Palestinian, Jordanians, anyone basically who could pass as white, who was Arab American generations before us. We're like, yeah, if we can say we're white and that means we're going to get some of that privilege, we're with them. And unfortunately, that didn't really trickle down in the way people expected it to, especially not in a post 9/11 America. So I'm going to share with you, this is in your book too, a controversy that I found myself in, but I think you kind of helped lay it out a little bit,
Yeah.
much more articulate than me. So one time I got into a big controversy online where Bishop Talbert Swan, who's from
Okay.
Boston area, he was making an argument before it even became a big argument, it was a couple of years ago, about Jesus not being white.
Yes.
So little old me goes in there, and I just made a comment. Like, I didn't think that it was going to be anything. I just thought I was having a conversation with this bishop who I had met in real life at a National Council of Black Churches convention that I went to one time that I was invited to. Anyway, so I said to him, I said, actually, the Muslims believe that and have a description of Jesus, and that Jesus is a copper skinned, woolly haired. And so we believe that too. And that's how he's described to us as Muslims. Jesus was never described to us as blonde with blue hair, blue eyes, etc. And then I also kind of went on to say that, they say Jesus of Nazareth, and Nazareth is in Palestine. Jesus went to Bethlehem is in Palestine. So anyways, so the point of the story is I basically was trying to reaffirm the argument that Jesus wasn't white. And of course, I got into the headlines. I was in every major newspaper about but basically saying that Jesus wasn't white and he was actually a Palestinian Jew, which I really believe. And I think Jesus, based on the Islamic description of Jesus, we make the argument that for us too, he was black based on the way his features were described. And so the question I had for you, Andre, especially for those of us who organize in interfaith spaces, and for those of us who faith is kind of a driving force of why we do this work. And also as we emulate figures that are very important, especially to people who follow Abrahamic faiths, especially for Christians and Muslims in particular, like Jesus is a very important figure to us. In fact, for us as Muslims, Jesus is mentioned more times in our holy book than our own beloved prophet, Muhammad, may peace and blessings be upon him. We have a whole chapter dedicated to the Virgin Mary. And so he's very reverent, like in our faith. And so why is it important, that the discussion always comes up? Why is it important for us to get to the point where we, break up with white Jesus, and how that kind of plays into our work in the movement?
For sure. So I wrote this chapter about breaking up with white Jesus because oftentimes when you look into history, wherever there's racial oppression, you find the Christian church, more times than not, And when I say the Christian church, I mean, as someone with 2 degrees in theology, and 7 years of full-time ministry in my 20s, I fully understand. There are tens of thousands of expressions of Christianity in the world. There's no one church, right? So we can't lump it all into one category. But historically, the Pope was writing papal bulls giving colonizers the permission to go into these indigenous lands and genocide people and steal land and enslave Africans and exploit them for labor and all that kind of stuff. The Christian Bible was used to justify Jim Crow, to justify enslavement. And even today, many white nationalist groups, they still use some version of Christianity to do this. And it's no coincidence back way back in history, these colonizers were taking an image of Jesus and kind of painting Jesus in their own image, right? So one of the most damning historical points for me is that when they were building slave ships and they would name them things like Fortune and Venture and all this kind of stuff. But one of the first slave ships was named after Jesus of Lubeck. And so they imagined that Jesus was like this a cosmic version of themselves, completely, sponsoring and patroning the enslavement of African people and the genocide of indigenous people, all that kind of stuff. And I felt like that, ideas don't die easily. And I felt like when I was starting to wake up and to push against this systemic racism in our time, that's what I was running up against, or with the white Christians that I'd grown up around, that they would tell me things like, well, racism is not a priority to God, which is an exact quote from a former friend, that I write about in the book. They would tell me things like that, like the things that are pressing on Black people about our own survival are not important to God. But those same people, if they had a child that had cancer, they wouldn't assume that God doesn't care about healing their child just because it's not, just because their child's name isn't written in the Bible. Those same people, go to Kroger or, Publix or Ralph's or whatever part of the country they live in, and they ask God to help them find a good parking space. And so I sat there and I really thought, like, if you believe that God would help you find a parking space at the grocery store, but God wouldn't stop a bullet for Philando Castile, then, like James Baldwin says, your God is probably white. Like, you made God in your own image. So all that summarized, I'm saying, is that, like, white Jesus has been a mascot for anti-Black racism for centuries. And like we just talked about, like, whiteness is not about skin color, although race involves skin color. This is about one's commitments, to power, like, the way that one views and exists in the world, right? So, yeah. So I find that people who worship that version of Jesus are often discouraged from participating in the movement for Black liberation, as I was. That's what, white Christians were trying to tell me, that, oh, well, yeah, Jesus doesn't care about that.
Lord have mercy. That's a wonderful chapter, folks. It's something to look forward to in the book. I think it's provocative, but I think Andre really articulates even how these things that we might even think you're like, oh, Jesus, like, what does that got to do with anything, or even just the Jesus that's been depicted, but how, sometimes even the best of us, and even the best of Christians, or people who really believe, they're following like compassion, kindness, love, and even that imagery of having a white Jesus. What does that actually mean? How deeply rooted is it? And are people even as thinking about it in the deep way? But anyway, that chapter is definitely something to look forward to. So a friend of ours is asking a question about I'm not that talented. I just know how to make some good trouble. I know how to talk a little truth, but that's about all I got. But you are also a musician. And I think, as we know, historically, in every movement, even around the world, not just here in the United States of America, there's always been a musical element to
Yeah,
revolution. And so I'd love for you to kind of talk a little bit about your music, why it inspires you and how it kind of plays into the larger context of your movement work and even this book that you wrote.
for sure. So um, when I started going through the things that I describe in this book, I was mostly focusing on music. I mean, still struggling, like, can I really make a career out of this? Should I do something else? So I talk about that in the book a lot. But basically, what I tell people is that before this story was in this form as a book, I had a list of songs that I was writing as I went through the things that I describe here. Because when I when I heard the news about the Charleston massacre, for instance, um, I looked around I remember crying for a good bit and feeling like I have to do something. I want to do more than cry. And I looked around the room and I saw my guitar there, and I was like, well, that's what I have. I'll write songs. I'll write music. And I'd had that reaction one time before that with Eric Garner when he was killed the year before. And so I did. I started writing songs, and before then I was writing songs about love and relationships, all that kind of stuff. But I said, I want to write about this. I want to write about social justice. I want to take Dr. King's words and put them into songs, and see if I can affect people's hearts and minds that way. Okay, the only thing was that the songs were so bad. They were so bad for years because it's not easy to just start writing about something else. It would take several years before I started writing songs that I was proud of about social justice, which was after like the murder of or the killing of Philando Castile and Alton Sterling. About in the years that followed that, I started getting the hang of doing that. And a part of why I write about that journey in the book is because I want for people to understand that these movements involve regular people using whatever we have to get involved in the struggle for freedom. And so I write about myself as a musician struggling to make music that resonates with people, having this life-changing experience, this watershed moment where I say, I want to use this for the freedom of Black people and getting into the movement. And what I found as I did that is I started meeting so many artists that have been involved in social change and seeing how essential they've been. For instance, one of my mentors, Sergio Popovich, who led the revolution that overthrew Slobodan Milosevic, was a bass player in a college band when he decided that he wanted to get involved in the struggle against the dictator. But the thing that provoked him into activism was actually seeing a band in Serbia careening through the public square on the back of a flatbed truck and singing political songs. And they were singing a song at the time that said, if we're busy fighting, Slobodan's war, when will we find time for sex? And that convinced Serja that activism could be fun. And so yeah, I continue to write songs in that way and to use my songs in that way. And the book is even divided up, in that way. So if someone were to listen to my songs on Spotify, especially over the last 4 years or so, you could find a song that goes with most of the chapters, because that's actually what I did. I was like, okay, like Break Up with White Jesus is totally like playing hooky, and chapter 1, Embracing the Apocalypse, is totally delusional. And I use lyrics to divide the chapters up into 3 parts.
Mm, mm, it's beautiful. So this question, Andre, is kind of a deep one. Um, and it's something I haven't been able to kind of figure out a little bit. Obviously, the idea of losing friendship, especially with people that you may have had, you broke bread with them, you went to concerts with them, you maybe even went to their wedding or went to, to celebrate some sort of accomplishment. Like, so it's not just the people that are like acquaintances, but maybe you're
Right.
like fifth grade teacher. I mean, I've
Yeah.
had experiences really looking at people I grew up with and people I went to school with and watching them put up like Blue Lives Matter because their brother's a cop, and then black people are criminals, and literally like writing things that I'm like
Yeah.
about to like faint on the floor. Like, how did I actually love these people? How did I
Right.
grow? How did I actually, how are these people my friends? And so the question really is about how do we get through the grief of leaving some of these people behind, especially
Yeah.
when we could actually remember many moments of joy with them and even
Yeah.
being happy to be in their presence. And now we learn these things about them, and although we feel like we're not aligned and that relationship kind of separates, but there of course is always going to be grief with losing these types of deep
Yeah.
friendships. So how did you kind of move through some of that?
Yeah, and I'm writing about those kinds of relationships in the book, as like these are people that I had deep relationship with, and walking away from those relationships was very difficult and very painful. And I think that it's just like grieving anything else. Like it takes a while, and it's definitely not linear, right? It's iterative of going through those stages of grief until you get to acceptance, right? And even sometimes I think acceptance isn't always permanent, right? Like sometimes it feels like, okay, all right, I've accepted that. And then 3 years later, I'm calling one of them trying to see like if there's any way to reconcile this. So I went back to bargaining, right? Um, and I think it's just, being gentle with yourself, being compassionate with yourself, and understanding that the only way, to navigate grief is to go through. Like, there's just no avoiding it. Avoiding it just always leads to problems, and sometimes our refusal to grieve is a source of more suffering for us because, like, a refusal to grieve can look like staying in a toxic relationship instead of leaving it because we don't want to go through the grief process, right?
Mm.
Um, or trying to fight for that, to be different, or trying to change people, it ends up being codependent and all that kind of stuff. And so, I mean, a big step is just really accepting it and allowing yourself to have the anger, allowing yourself to have those moments. Like, I had moments that I didn't write about in the book because there wasn't room, but I had moments where I was just in my apartment, just lying on the floor and weeping over people that I really loved, but were just never going to come around as far as I know. And knowing that I have to walk away from this for my own personal mental health, like for my own health, and also for the sake of what I know is possible in the world. Because I know that it's possible for us to be free. I know that it's possible. But we can't build the movement that we need if we're standing on the ground floor arguing with people who want to deny that the problem exists.
That's right.
You know?
That's right. I wanted to acknowledge something that someone's saying here, Andre. Our sister Christine is sharing. She says, I'm Black. I was adopted and raised by a white family that supports Trump and Blue Lives Matter. I will not be around that. It's painful, but
Mm-hmm.
boundaries are a must. And that's just how deep this is. Sometimes it's not just your friends, right? It could actually be your mom and dad that are, people who don't want to acknowledge that you have a different experience, especially as an adopted child. So I appreciate you, Christine, for sharing that.
Absolutely.
Um, I wanted to, something else that we have a sister here named Seba that asked this, and I think it's important because your book is about like we can't be doing these like little niceties, cordials. Like we're talking about systemic racism. We're talking about a state of emergency for Black people, for Indigenous people. There's no time for I'm going to negotiate my existence to you and
Mm-hmm.
things of that matter. Even this the kind of performative like diversity and inclusion kind of work that people do, which I'm not saying is totally irrelevant. I know the importance of it, but it does not and it will not kind of
Right.
really address the root cause of what people are fighting for. It's not going to get us to the kind of liberation
Right.
that we're all looking for. So the question really is, that people are with you. This is a moment of revolution. Like we need a revolution. But for people who
Mm-hmm.
don't hold institutional power, and that really means all of us, a lot of us, especially Black and brown people in our respective countries, how do we stay believing in a revolution, start revolutions in places
Yeah.
where after all these generations we still hold very institutional power?
Right. Yeah, this is a great question. And I have two thoughts about this. One, I write about just the need for institutions in the book. Like it's later, I think it's called Building Our Own Tables.
Hmm.
So that's a very short answer is we have to build our own institutions, right? There are also people who are arguing about the validity of seeking power in established institutions, and I think they're onto something with that, But I am a huge proponent of civil resistance, and that's what I'm pushing in this book. And civil resistance is usually non-institutional. It is people's. It's the self-organized society, right? We're organizing ourselves to pressure the system to do what it would otherwise not do. And the reason why we have that, the reason why we're able to do that is because these institutions, the powers that be, the system, it is using our resources and talents and time and labor anyway. So we are the ones that are giving institutions their power. And so the trick is often to organize people outside of those existing institutions to use what we would usually be giving the status quo and to use it with some type of autonomy to leverage the power that we have against the system and say, okay, well, you want for things to run, right? Well, nothing's going to run until we get what we want.
Right. That's right. Um, listen, whoever these folks are, I mean, I recognize some of the people as people that I know, but these folks are brilliant and have some really brilliant questions for you. And I'm just gonna go with them. I'm just gonna lay back and then let these people ask the questions. This is an important question that I actually haven't found an answer to, Andre, and maybe you can help us think through this, especially for those of us who are non-Black people of color who are trying to also go get our cousins and
Yeah.
also get our white friends too sometimes. Maybe we feel like we're like the buffer where we can say, wait a minute, you don't have to go through all this like extra labor. Let me
Mm-hmm.
try to do some labor for you. But the question is, how do I know, or how do we know when we're stuck in the bargaining phase? Like when we're going back to get our people, like when do we know if this is an investment that we should be making, or that we're just stuck in a place where we just kind of got to get out of there? This is not going to work.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts about this, and I'm also curious about what you think about this too, because you have so much organizing experience. And, for me, it's like I very much live by the spectrum of allies. I'm like, where are they? And I know who I'm targeting on the spectrum of allies. So because I'm very much aware that I am not the Messiah, the movement does not depend on me. I am more than willing to let somebody else deal with people who are not on my part of the spectrum. And for those who don't know what I'm talking about, the spectrum of allies is very simple. It's just the idea that people don't exist on a binary where it's people who are for and people who are against. But there are people who are actively for. There are people who are passively for. Who, they believe in your values, but they're not doing anything. There are people who consider themselves neutral, and then there are people who are against you, not doing anything, and there are people who are actively against. So I pretty much mess with the passive allies. Like my people are the people who are like, I care about racism. I don't know what to do. I'm like, here, let me tell you. Here's some
Yeah.
ideas, right? Even if they're active supporters, I don't even really deal with them. I don't dismiss them, but I'm like, the things that they need are not things that I'm providing. I work with them, right? And then I ignore the passive opposers and the active opposers. But I have friends who like they deal with passive opposers. They go out and have coffee with them. They walk them through that thing, and I'm like, gosh, more power to you. Like because they have excuse me for the Christianese here, but the grace to do that. They have the capacity, the energy. So that's how I look at it, and like I'm a little bit more gracious with Black people who are, more colonized in their thinking. Like I'll give them a bit more energy than I would non-Black people. But even so, like I don't consider people like Candace Owen my responsibility.
That's
You
right.
know, if they want to go down with the ship of whiteness, they're a free person. They're a grown woman, you know.
I
So
agree.
yeah.
I mean, for me, just to, that's a question that comes up for me often. I found myself, especially in light of like my organizing with the Women's March. Before
Mhm.
that, I actually never organized with white people, not because I didn't want to organize with white people, but I was organizing in a post 9/11 America. So I was mostly organizing Muslim Americans that really
Uh-huh.
kind of were across the spectrum, but mostly immigrants from the Middle East and North Africa and South Asians, and of course, Black Muslims, more in the
Yeah.
New York City area in the beginning when I first started organizing. And then I ventured into the immigrant rights movement, which of course are people of color, mostly Central American, Asian American, African immigrants, as well as Middle Eastern, North African, and South Asian immigrants. And then when I ventured, as part of the intersectional lens that I was trying to look at all the issues with, I went, of course, into the larger kind of criminal justice reform, mass incarceration movement, which, of course, at least from the vantage point I was, they were mostly Black. So I never had to
Mm.
organize with white people. And even if white people were in space with us, they might have brought a resource or came to the table, but I didn't necessarily organize with them until
Mm.
I got to the Women's March. And when I got to the Women's March, there were Black women I was organizing with who were like, don't go in there. Don't even waste your time. I'm telling you,
Wow.
our mothers tried this, the grandmother tried this, this doesn't work. And Tamika and me and Carmen had this conversation, and we kind of was like, let's just, you never know. I mean, this is a moment, and
Right.
maybe this what Trump, signifies could be an opportunity for us to kind of bring this all together. And so when we got into the Women's March, many of the women we were organizing with came there as an act of rebellion. Lots of those women were either married to someone who was like a Trump supporter, or they kind of, all
Mm.
of a sudden, people in their families kind of true colors came out, and so maybe they never
Mhm.
really had these deep conversations about anti-Black racism or sexism, or even, things around Muslims and refugees and all the things that kind of Trump brought up. And all of a sudden they realize, wait a minute, I'm not aligned, my values aren't aligned. So they came, many of them told us this. I'm not even like, trying to interpret. They told us we came here as an act of rebellion. So they came here
Right.
rebelling against something that they loved. Anyway, and so a lot of the women of color that I was kind of organizing with were exhausted. They were like, really, do we got to do this here? I thought we came here because we're coming to organize. Like, do we got to teach these people some things? So
Right.
I kind of actually became that person in the Women's March. I was like, okay, I'll deal with the white ladies. And one of the things
Mm.
that I felt about many of them, one of them actually is Bob Bland. And Bob Bland was the fourth national co-chair of the Women's March. She's a white woman from Virginia, and was like a fashion entrepreneur, white woman, came from, uh, was generally progressive, but didn't really have a lot of deep relationships with Black folk, and didn't really know nothing about Muslims. She didn't know nothing about Palestine. She just had a lot of, like, a lack of information. And she actually has not become, for me, I consider her now to be more of an accomplice than an ally. She's a woman that took a
Mm.
lot of hits to defend women of color in the Women's March, particularly defend
Mhm.
Black women, even though she was risking herself being attacked, which she did. And so I say to people all the time, I have had a few examples of white women that I've been able to work on and give grace to and give emotional labor to, that have transformed into ways that have been beneficial to our movements, as they
Yeah.
kind of go and become the ones that go and get their cousins. And there have been times where I have realized this is probably not going to work. Like, we have the
Mm.
conversation, we do a follow up, and then you kind of feel like the person's just coming back with more arguments. And then that's
Mhm.
when I'm like, yeah, it looks like you and I can maybe respect one another, but we're not going to get aligned, and we're not going to be able to just be any deeper than just knowing one another. So
Right.
I want to say to folks here that, there are some people worth investing in.
Yeah.
And I just think that we need to be careful about making our Black friends be the ones to have to do all of that, especially
Yeah.
with everything that's happening around here. And I'd love for you, Andre, there are some folks here that I know, many of whom are white allies already. And I know some of them have told me in many ways, as white folks, like, we don't want to be the white people you're talking about in your book.
Mhm. Mhm.
And they oftentimes know that they're not perfect, and there are certain things
Mhm.
that they need to do better. And I'd love for you to share things like, if you are someone who is, really wants to be a really good ally to Black people in particular, what are the things you want to call people
Yeah, I feel like when I think about the folks that I met in the movement that I still consider, like you said, accomplices, like a big part of it is that they're just doing their own work. Like they are in no way depending on me to be their sounding board, their conscience, their magical Negro, to their coach, you know, or even like a source of affirmation because like I because I'm a black man, I do understand some level of privilege in relation to some other people, right? And I know what it feels like to have people who are more marginalized than me in my life and to want to hold on to them because they give me a sense that I'm one of the good guys, right? And the white people that are in my life, they just don't do that to me, you
Mm.
know? So I mean, they're doing their own studying, they're doing their own reading, they're involved in racial justice groups, um, they're open to feedback, like they're totally open to like, all right, if they're, hearing that, how their words or actions might be might affect others, even if it's not intentional. And the thing is, like, I can't remember what his name is right now. Oh, it's Harry Kondabolu. I don't know if you follow him, the
Oh yeah,
comedian.
Hari, yeah.
Yeah. And Hari, like when he's in his special on Netflix, when he's like, "We need John Brown white people."
Yep.
I always laugh at that because there are times where like white people show up and they feel like you should just be grateful that they're here,
Mm.
in
Oh, I
movement
know
space.
about that.
You should be
Mm.
grateful that I even care about this because I have the option to not do it, right?
That's right.
And I'm like, I'm not impressed because are you John Brown? you know, are you willing? And when I say that, I don't mean you necessarily picking up guns to fight this, but I mean, are you really about this? Are you really putting your body, in this struggle? Because basically, what I'm saying, the white people that are in my life that I consider accomplices to me, they understand that their liberation is at stake too.
Mm.
You know, they understand what whiteness invites them to do as people, which is check out, you know, to not have empathy for people who aren't in their racial group, to be comfortable with inequality and all that kind of stuff. And they don't want that for themselves. They don't want that for their children. They don't want that for the countries that they live in, all that. So,
Mm. 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 I'm actually typing a quote here, Andre, that you just reminded me of. It's a quote by Aboriginal woman named Leela Watson.
yes. Yeah.
Uh, mine, because I feel like people should just copy and paste it and put it somewhere because I'm telling you, it speaks to what I'm looking for, and and really similarly to what Andre is writing about in his book. It says, "If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come here because you believe that your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." And I think those are the white people that I'm looking for.
Yeah.
The people that believe that, yes, they may have or may be experiencing a whole lot more privilege than, of course, more so a lot more privilege than Black folk and Indigenous folks, but also, of course, other non-Black people of color, but still believing that although you may be experiencing more privilege or have more privilege and access, you're still not fully free because we're not fully free. So
Right.
when people come with that kind of sentiment, I feel like that's where you start feeling the accomplice over the ally. So an ally is like
Mhm.
the woman who wants to like save the Afghan girls, who by the way need definitely a lot of saving right now. I don't know. The Taliban is saying that girls are not allowed to go to school right now after sixth grade. I mean, it's
Yeah.
just horrific. That's a topic for another day. But I'm an organizer, Andre, and then we're coming up on almost time, and I we have a pretty good group that kind of came to hang out with us tonight. And I like to go to book talks too because I'm just that kind of person, especially when it's like around this time. I could just It's after dinner, you're kind of getting ready for the night, and you get to come and listen. But I hope people like also think about these kinds of book events, especially with books like these, as an organizing tool. And I hope that first of all, you have already, Greenlight has already posted the link to buy the book and you're going to get a discount. And since you're getting a discount, you might as well get 2 books. And I would love for you yourself to read the book. But I also want you to get one and gift it to somebody, right?
Yeah.
And you don't want to gift it to someone who is in the, even in the passive opposition, or even in the active opposition. Maybe someone who's neutral, maybe someone who's kind of going on with their lives, people that you love that are like having brunch, going to work, picking up their kids from school, like, people who are not bad people. They're not mean. They're not people who are actively like in opposition to our movements or to the things that Black and brown people want, but people you think need to be like, poked a little bit, people who need to be provoked a little bit. And so this book is definitely going to do that. And for those of you who I do know also that are here, who are Black and brown in the movements, this is a book that's going to reaffirm your experiences and give you a different vantage point, which is obviously Andre's a different person and is organizing in sometimes different contexts geographically, just some of the experiences he's had also as a musician. So for me, this really, reaffirmed my own experiences, because a lot of times people were like, Linda, you're so dramatic. Like, come on, white people don't, that, like, really seriously, like, are you, and I just feel like we have that opportunity to, educate one another, but also to reaffirm each other. We're going to end with this question from Farah. And Farah is a young person, a young Black woman who is an organizer. She is absolutely incredible. Andre, I hope one day you get to meet her. She's one of the most wonderful young people that I follow online. And she asked you this question, and I love it. And she says, over the years, how have you found joy when times were rough?
Yeah. I have so much to say about this. One is, so I remember one of my favorite freedom fighters is Mandela. And from his autobiography, I remember the chapter title where he said the movement became his life. And I remember really admiring that and even wanting that and aspiring to that. I see so many people like that. And now I have a different opinion of that.
Me too.
Yeah, I have a very different opinion of that now. And I write about that in the book as well. There's a moment where one activist, he says, everyone always talking about dying for the movement. Fuck that shit. I want you to live for the movement. And I remember taking that to heart. So one thing is that I am trying to keep my feet on the ground as a regular person, an ordinary person who loves to make music, to resist the temptation to let my identity, like let the struggle become my identity, And so something that I love to do, and I think everyone who gets deeper involved in this work, should always have things that you just remember your hobbies, remember the things that you love doing, and keep doing those things. One of the things I love to do is to DJ. I am a good DJ. I love to DJ. I don't do it for money. I don't have a website up. I won't print business cards. And while we were going through some of this stuff later on, I continued to throw dance parties. And then what happened was my movement folks just came to my house with all the rest of the folks that would come to these dance parties, and we continue to have dance parties. So I continue to do that. Another thing is I am always reading a book about hope. Always. Right now I'm reading a book called Militant Joy. And, it just always feeding that part of me. I tell people all the time, you have to take breaks and eat churros. I don't literally mean churros, but I mean whatever it is, whatever it is that just, that does it for you in that way. I make time for that, And I also realize that joy is a movement's secret weapon. It sustains activism. It keeps people engaged. It makes it sustainable. But also, like, when you use humor as an organizing tool, more people want to participate in it. And it also, like, makes it much easier for oppression to backfire. Right. So, like, these are things that I remember. Also, like, having friends, like, community is a big part of this, right? Someone asked me the other day in an interview, Andre, what makes you so strong? Like they've been following me for years, and I said, what makes you so strong? And I said, I don't consider myself a strong person, but it's interdependence. The thing that you see, is that I have, and I don't always know this, especially when you're a truth teller. Sometimes I think that truth tellers start to feel isolated and feel like, you know, man, am I the only one that sees all this going on? But I am surrounded by great people who care about the world and want to see it differently and are doing what they can to make it better. And when I get together with some of those people and we just have a drink
That's right.
or we sing karaoke or we take a walk up a hill, and just look over the city of LA, like those moments are so beautiful. So that's what I would say is like nourish joy, chase it, cultivate it, make time for it, and always remember that that thing. And I don't know if Farah, I don't know if you face this temptation, but I know that I face this pressure and I'm bucking against it. I think that there is a cultural thing where people feel like you have to perform a level of radicalness that at times, it comes off to me as jaded. um I said in the book, like, you have to be able to spell all cops are bastards with your cigarette smoke, and everything is problematic and all that kind of stuff. No, like, eat ice cream, drive with your sunroof open, and listen to Billy Joel at the, at a ungodly decibel level. Double Dutch, whatever it is that you love. Like, remember that we do this work so that people can enjoy their lives more. Right? And so we should be enjoying our lives in the process. We deserve it.
Absolutely. We're going to end with this beautiful note from someone who's here with us named Eden, who says, be authentic to yourself within your own journey through social justice. And I think that could help you stay kind of grounded and rounded. So remember, folks, you are going to get Andre's book. Greenlight's giving you a discount, so that's why you're going to get two. You can follow Andre Henry. Andre Henry. So simple, right? You don't even have to write it down. Just you'll know it from the book. And I just want to say thank you to Greenlight for this opportunity, and thank you to my beloved dear friend who I love so much, and I'm so honored to be here, Andre, for just being Andre first and foremost, and also for writing this beautiful book.
Yeah. Thank you for being here, Linda. I really appreciate it. And thanks to Greenlight for having us.
And Andre, Linda, thank you both for your time tonight and for a fantastic reading and conversation. And thank you, everyone, for joining us and spending this hour with us tonight. I'll reiterate, Linda, one more time. You can buy the discounted book on our website or in our store. And congratulations, Andre, and everyone have a great evening.
Okay.
Night.
Good night.